Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the head springs of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. What are children for? I have 4 of them, so I think about that quite a lot. Today I want to ask and answer that question by sharing with you a talk I recently gave at the regional gathering of the Association of Classical Christian Educators right here in my hometown. I hope you enjoy. Well, hey everyone, I'm really glad to be here. As Rich said, I'm with the Colson Center. I've been with the organization for quite some time now. I don't know where the time went, actually. I started as an intern under Chuck Colson, and things kind of snowballed from there. I told him that I needed to go home to Florida for a while to finish college and get married, but then I could start writing for the organization and working with the podcast and things like that. So that's what evolved. They're now in Colorado Springs. John Stone Street heads up the ministry, and he's actually the host of Breakpoint. So every day on the radio, on the podcast, whatever, you're going to hear John Stone Street, and he's my boss, and I work with him. And so I can't say anything bad about him, but I'll refrain from that. I think I took all the negative remarks out of the talk here. My talk today is entitled, What Are Children For? The Mystery of Teaching Divine Imagers. And I want to start off by illustrating why I think children are a very countercultural choice in today's world. Comedian Jim Gaffigan has made me laugh about a lot of things. Maybe you guys are fans too. The best are his jokes about Disney World, which highlight just how weird that whole place is. And you can see why he says his favorite ride is the air-conditioned bus back to the hotel, because it's often, the pit of Hades in Orlando in the summer. But Gaffigan also frequently jokes about his family and his 5 children. When people find out he has that many kids and that they all lived with him and his wife in this 2-bedroom apartment in New York City, they often say, well, that's one way to live your life. Kevin DeYoung, maybe you've seen or heard about him. He's a pastor in North Carolina. He recently wrote about his favorite Jim Gaffigan line in an article in First Things. Gaffigan says, big families are like waterbed stores. They used to be everywhere. Now they're just weird. I think I'd use a slightly different word, though. I'd say that big families are countercultural, not just weird. And that's why today I want to seriously consider with you the answer to what I think is one of the most important questions that parents and educators today and the church can ask. What are children for? And I think there are really 4 answers to that critical question. And here they are in brief, right at the start. Children are for God. They're for us. They're for themselves. And they're for the world. But we need to think very deeply about what each of those answers means and why they matter. Like I said, one of the most countercultural things you can do in today's culture, even today's world, is to have children, or at least to have more than 1.7 or whatever the current average is. Writing in First Things, DeYoung observes that the paradigmatic affliction of the Old Testament, barrenness, is now the great desire of nations. Outside of Africa, the birth rates worldwide right now are reaching historic lows. Italy, Spain, Portugal, Thailand, and South Korea will actually lose half of their populations by the end of this century. It's hard to believe when you hear so much about overpopulation and climate change and environmental disaster and so forth, but humankind is actually on the trajectory to start shrinking in the next generation or so. Europe as a whole is actually going to shed 250 million people by the same time. That's the estimate currently. The BBC reports that within 75 years, virtually every country on the planet will have a shrinking population. The reason for this is simple. According to poll after poll and study after study, people in affluent, developed nations just don't want kids anymore. One Pew Research poll I cited in World Magazine recently really tells it all. When asked why they haven't had children, adults in my age cohort ranked financial barriers, which is the thing that's most often, blamed for their hesitancy to have kids, as a distant third in their reasons. A majority actually said that the top reason, the number one reason why they haven't had kids is that they simply don't want them. They're not a part of their lifestyle. They don't fit in. Hillary Hoffauer, writing at Business Insider, really hit the nail on the head. And she was writing approvingly of this attitude. She said, millennial women who are now in their prime childbearing years have normalized the idea of choice, and their choice reflects a calculation that having children just isn't worth it. DeYoung goes a little bit deeper. He thinks it's what's really behind this loss of interest in bringing the next generation into existence is actually a lack of faith. He writes, the reasons for declining fertility are no doubt many and varied. Surely, some couples want to have more children but are unable to. Others struggle with economic pressures or health limitations. But fertility does not plummet worldwide without deeper issues at play, especially when people around the world are right now objectively richer, healthier, and afford more conveniences than at any other time in human history. That's just true historically. Though individuals make their choices for many reasons, as a species, we are suffering from a profound spiritual sickness, a metaphysical malaise in which children seem to be a burden on our time and a drag on our potential happiness. Our malady is a lack of faith, and nowhere is the disbelief more startling than in the countries that once made up Christendom. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, God promised a delighted Abraham in Genesis 26. Today, in the lands of Abraham's offspring, says DeYoung, that blessing strikes most people as a curse. But not only is it countercultural to have more than one or two children in today's world, it's also countercultural to educate them in the way that we all are doing here. I often refer to an episode of That 70s Show, which, for the record, I never watched. It wasn't my show. But there's a moment that has been immortalized by internet memes, which I do consume in fairly high volumes. One of the characters is about to go off to college, and she announces, hey, everyone, I've decided to major in philosophy. And another character quips, oh, good, because they just opened that big philosophy factory in Green Bay. The implication is, it's obvious, right? Philosophy is a worthless thing to study because unlike, say, an engineering degree, which has real practical use and cash value, philosophy has none. It teaches no technical skills. It's not economically profitable in an obvious way. In the same way, classical Christian education is far from the obvious way to set our kids up for a 3-bedroom, 2-car, middle-class life, to get into a good college so they can get a good job, so they can get a good retirement before they die. And that's what education's all about, right? That's the point, right? Well, that's what the culture says. But you see, one of the ironclad laws of human nature is that you can't live without answering the deep and ultimate who, what, where, and why questions. Who am I? What's the nature of reality? Where did I come from? And where am I going? Why am I here? Why is there evil and suffering? Who is God? The decision not to answer these questions as part of your education is in fact a decision to settle for and believe whatever answer the surrounding culture predominantly gives you. If education is all about attaining technical proficiency to obtain financial success, we have to ask of that goal, why? Why should we care? Is that the meaning of life? But now you see, we're doing philosophy. I'm reminded of a popular Christian slogan that says, no creed but Christ. We could paraphrase this. I don't need theology. I just need Jesus. To which we might very reasonably ask, well, who is Jesus? And the moment someone replies to that question, they're doing theology. The same is true of all ultimate questions. The moment someone tells me that the purpose of education is to get a good job, I ask them, why? Why should you want a good job? What's the purpose of that? And it usually only takes 2 or 3 whys to get down below the basement of their worldview, into this kind of terrifying void of existential uncertainty. I can't imagine living with that kind of uncertainty, always just lurking below the surface of my life, waiting to be revealed by anybody who asks why a couple of times. I want to be careful here because it's true that many people never answer those questions in a conscious way, and they still manage to live decent and contributing lives. There's something to be said for just being a human and doing what comes naturally. Why do bees build hives? Because they're bees. Why do birds build nests? Because they're birds. Why do humpback whales migrate? Well, because Disney Plus needs awesome documentaries about swimming with whales in Hawaii, and it's too cold to do that off of Alaska, where they spend most of the year. But also, yeah, because they're humpback whales. And why do humans pair off and have sex and bear children and want those children to live successful lives? Well, because we're humans. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not gainsaying that. But one of the things that humans also do, something that no other creature we know of does, is ask who, what, where, and why questions. Because we, alone among all living things on this earth, understand the concept of purpose. We understand, or at least we once understood, that the world is charged with intention and design. All the way back in ancient Greece, philosophers asked that about that design and that intention. They looked for causes. Aristotle suggested famously that there are four basic causes: formal, final, material, and efficient. When you look at a marble statue of Apollo, for instance, and ask, what caused this? There are really at least four answers. You can say, it was caused by whatever geologic process produces marble. And you would be right in a limited sense. That's true. You could say, it was caused by a hammer and a chisel. We can see the marks right there on the statue. And again, you would be right in a limited sense. You could say, an artist sculpted this, made it from the marble. Ah, but even then, what is an artist? What is his or her intention for that object? Ultimately, you've got to say that this artist intended to make a sculpture to represent the god Apollo. In other words, the artist had a plan or form in mind and purpose to make an object that would finally embody that form. What caused the statue? Well, ultimately, an idea in the mind of the designer. Modern people have almost entirely jettisoned these highest two types of cause. We rarely ask what things are for. Instead, we ask, what are they made of? What's happened to them? And then we try to invent a nature out of those facts. It's like saying the marble and the tools are the whole reason for the statue. And we even do this with human beings. We do this with children. You can see how it plays out. What caused children? Well, random evolution and some drive to reproduce, perhaps, but ultimately, it was my choice. They came from my body and my wife's body, and my body, my choice, right? Well, what are they for? Whatever you want, I guess. I brought them into existence. But then if children's purpose is subjective, determined by those who bring them into existence, and perhaps eventually by the children themselves when they reach adulthood, is that really any different from saying that they have no purpose? If they have no purpose outside of subjective ideas that we impose on them, or they choose for themselves, then what makes a good and healthy child? You see the problem? There's no standard by which to judge goodness and healthiness in a child. What makes a well-educated one? Well, subjective. What does it mean for a child to grow up well, to thrive, to be a good human being? These questions rapidly expand and become crucial for the whole of society, for the very foundations of civilization and order and law. See, that's the amazing part. Someone who has watched a few YouTube videos summarizing Nietzsche's philosophy will say, there's no set of meaning for human being. There's nothing that makes a human being a good human being or a bad human being intrinsically. We get to decide what it means. We are truly and frighteningly and awesomely free. We are like gods. A friend of mine gave a talk at a small academic conference recently where he asked what it means, this word freedom. We hear it a lot these days. We love the word freedom, perhaps only slightly less than the word rights, fundamental rights. But what does it mean to be truly free? We were beside the ocean at this conference, where residents sometimes see Atlantic right whales breaching. You can tell I like sea life. And he used an obvious example. He said, imagine you've seen the poor whales flailing about there out in the water, in the ocean. And having compassion, you set up a winch and you dragged one up onto the beach with heavy machinery. And you said, I've saved you. You're free, Mr. Whale. Run free and skip and jump and play on the beach like me. Would the whale be free? Well, of course not. He'd be far less free than ever before. He can't even star in a Disney Plus documentary anymore. Why not? Well, because it's not a whale's nature to be on a beach. When a whale is on a beach, that's bad news for the whale. He can't go anywhere. He only has 4 or 5 hours to live at best. His nature means that there's no freedom on the beach because a whale is not for the beach. It doesn't belong there. The whale is for the ocean. In other words, the whale has a purpose, a design, an intention, a form, a nature. There are many ways to say it. The artist who made whales made them to be free through certain behaviors in a certain environment. And the same is true of us, which means to be a good and free human, especially a young and growing one. And to answer our big question, what are children for? We need to know something about the purpose of the artist who crafted them. This question is still more urgent because, as C.S. Lewis points out in his masterpiece, Mere Christianity, the higher and more glorious a being is by its created nature, the better or the worse it can become. He writes that a cow can't be very good or very bad at all. It's just a cow. A dog can be a bit better or a bit worse. A human being? Well, he concluded that on a scale of cow to dog, or rather, on a scale of cow to God, got that backwards. A little less Dixia kicking in there. We're decidedly closer to God as human beings than the cow. He put our potential like this in another one of his essays, and it's got to be one of the most powerful things he ever wrote. It's one of my favorites. He said, it is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest, most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Or else a horror and a corruption, such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or the other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all of our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked with a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these things are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, snub, marry, exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. If we are the product of an artist not merely an accident, whose purpose and freedom are entirely subjective, if we've got a nature, then the question, what are children for, has several very definite answers. And if Lewis is right, then getting those answers right is of cosmic and eternal importance. So first of all, children are for God. To say this is a countercultural claim is itself kind of an understatement. There's a book from a couple of years ago by Trevin Wax called Rethink Yourself. I interviewed him about it on the Upstream podcast, and to this day, it's one of my top recommendations. The premise is pretty simple. There are three basic ways of forming and expressing selfhood. And our dominant cultural way right now, in this country, in this continent, in this culture, is by far the outlier historically. We're extremely weird. You see, when we look inward first to find out who we are. Sound familiar? Think Disney movies here. All you needed all along was right here, inside your heart. It's a liturgy repeated over and over again in all our entertainment and media. Then we look around, second, seeking to externalize our identity and conform traditions and institutions and relationships and even the law to our inner sense of selfhood. And this is why we prize authenticity as a culture. To fail to do so would be to betray who you really are deep down inside, which of course is the highest authority, naturally. And finally, we look up as a culture to justify or perhaps to deify our sense of internal self with a religious or spiritual notion that endorses our chosen internal identity. And this is how you get statements like, the God I believe in would never tell me who I can and can't love. Notice who's on the throne here. Not God, the self. Again, as Wax notes, this is an extremely recent and historically isolated way of thinking about selfhood. By far, the dominant mode of discovering selfhood, both historically and globally, was the around, up, in method. People throughout time, and in much of the world even today, have first looked around them at their culture, their nation, their family, caste, station, etc., and determined who they should be based on that. If your dad was a farmer, you were a farmer. If your village was Hindu, you were Hindu. Simple as that. They then looked up to discern the spiritual order that sanctioned and enriched this social order and helped them understand why it mattered in the first place. And finally, they looked within to discover how they fit into both of these universal, given, determined ways of understanding identity. Now, not to spoil the book, but Wax proposes a third way of understanding selfhood. And he believes it's actually the biblical and historically Christian way. We first look up to the God who made us and what he reveals about us. Then around to discern our place in his world and the human context in which he has placed us. And finally, we look inward to conform ourselves to those two truths and to discern our unique place within them. Of course, both the traditional and Christian approach involve the crucial idea that reality is a given. It's not subjective. It's not something we determine and impose on the world. Reality really is a certain way. And it's up to us to conform to that certain way and live within it, not try to conform it to our preferences. So what is the reality when it comes to children? Well, we first look up, then around, then finally in. What do we discover about children? Well, first of all, we discover that children are creatures made in the image of God. They have, as Lewis said, certain godlike qualities. They have their own wills, their own abilities and talents, their own distinct genius. They may even end up being smarter or stronger or more virtuous than their parents. Or they may someday judge and reject what their parents believe. They are, in fact, responsible moral agents, answerable ultimately not to you and me, but to the one who made them. In other words, they are first and foremost His. In biblical terms, being made in God's image is a concept that has nearly inexhaustible richness. There's so many answers to what that means. And I think the best approach is a sort of all of the above approach rather than pitting them against one another. One of the things it probably, or I would say certainly means, is that human beings, our children, are the crown of creation. They're vice regents or co-rulers with God, intended to govern and steward and beautify His creation in ways that honor Him. They're natural masters of everything around them, uniquely suited among all of God's creatures to represent and exercise God's authority on earth. Children enter our world, in other words, as royalty. I love the way Lewis does this in Narnia. Have you ever noticed the weirdest part about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It's not the talking animals. It's not the Christmasless winter. It's not the Turkish delight. It's not even the interdimensional travel through a coat closet. It's the fact that when Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy Pevensey arrive in Narnia, every creature immediately recognizes them as kings and queens. What's up with that? Even the enemy knows that they are royalty immediately. There are thrones waiting for them in a castle by the sea. And the prophecy even says that Narnia won't be right as a country unless sons and daughters of Adam and Eve rule it. This is a picture, I think, a picture he's giving us of the role into which our children are naturally born. Remember the cow versus the dog versus the person? In a human child, you have something so excellent in its potential that she can corrupt or save nations. He can twist the universe out of shape or set it in some beautiful way right again. But these royal creatures who rule as vice regents rule under a higher authority. That's the meaning of the term vice regent. And that means children also exist to worship. This is why the Pevensies, or three of them at any rate, immediately recognize Aslan as the one who gives them their titles. And that need to worship someone or something that we see in Lewis's fictional children and our children is the same need that we find within ourselves. Worship is something that we instinctively, even inevitably do as human beings. Have you ever walked out alone on a beach just after the passing of a thunderstorm? You can see it still rolling through the clouds. Have you ever watched the sun rise over the mountains? If you have, then you probably know that tug deep inside. And it's a tug to say, thank you. For Christians, there's no difficulty answering that tug. We know the name and the address of the one to whom we are grateful. But even non-believers feel that tug on a regular basis. Andrew Peterson has this magnificent song. Maybe you've heard it. It's called Don't You Want to Thank Someone? And it plays with this idea. He sings, don't you ever wonder why, in spite of all that's wrong here, there's still so much that goes so right, and beauty abounds. Because sometimes when you walk outside, the air is full of song here. The thunder rolls and the baby sighs and the rain comes down. And when you see the spring has come and it warms you like a mother's kiss, don't you want to thank someone? Don't you want to thank someone for this? The lesson we can glean from this is that part of our job as parents is to direct children's natural human urge to worship toward its true end, the God who made them. And this is becoming easier in some surprising ways right now. I've recently done a good bit of writing and talking about the death of new atheism. Remember back in the early 2000s when books like Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great were coming out? Unbelief and materialism were all the rage at that point. The debates, the media attention, the bumper stickers. Remember the one with the little walking fish, a parody of the Christian ichthus? Scientific objectivity and hard evidence were at a premium culturally. This was a huge movement. And a lot of Christian parents taught their kids apologetics as if this was what they'd have to face, a bunch of materialist skeptics. Where is it today? Which atheist bestsellers can you name from the last 10 years? When was the last time a major atheist author went on a top 5 talk show? I can't remember. It's remarkable how few there actually are. The silence from skeptics has led mainstream media outlets to ask questions like, these are real headlines, by the way, whatever happened to new atheism? And why is atheism no longer cool? Part of the answer, I think, is that people got tired of having nothing to worship. Materialism is a hard worldview to maintain because humans are inherently religious creatures. We're even mystics, I would say. G.K. Chesterton once observed that a healthy dose of mysticism is actually a critical ingredient to sanity. All of this means that in your child, there dwells a natural-born mystic, someone who looks at the world around them, who sees those thunderclouds and those sunsets and hears those birds singing and gravitates without anyone nudging them toward reverence and praise as a response. This is the testimony of human history. Atheism is not the rule. It is the exception and always has been. One of the things we must recognize as Christian parents and educators as we ask ourselves, what are children for? Is that this impulse to worship is at the beating heart of who we are as a race, as a species. We are creation contemplating itself and its creator. And deep down inside, we're all born knowing this fact. It takes a great deal of self-delusion, as a matter of fact, to forget that fact, which is probably why the new atheism is such old news. But children aren't created just to worship. In Christian homes and schools, they're discipled and aimed at that worship through the redemption found only in Jesus Christ. And this goes beyond creation into a deep and wonderful mystery that will only fully flower in the new creation. You see, in Christian homes, our children come to belong to God, not in spite of their parentage, but in part through and because of that parentage. Regardless of whether you're a Credo Baptist or a Paedo Baptist, to be raised into true faith by Christian parents and Christian teachers means that you are not only natural royalty, but are redeemed from sin into co-rulership with Christ, making you an heir of God's renewed creation by adoption, a little brother or sister of High King Jesus. But more on that in just a second. First, we need to talk about the second answer to our big question. What are children for? And this answer is, they're for us. I don't know about you all, but I never used to cry while reading books or watching movies before I had kids. Now I can barely get through Wreck-It Ralph. I was a mess trying to read Narnia aloud to my children. I don't fully understand what's going on. But there's something about having children that deepens your emotional life and your experiences of the world. Things mean more than they did before. You empathize more deeply than you could ever have empathized before. Pain and evil frighten you like never before. But love and beauty also move you like never before. And I think part of it has to do with the way that children draw us out of ourselves and make us care again about the fate of others and of God's world. Think about this. Children are living testaments that the future is a place worth inhabiting. They give adults a reason to care about what happens after we're dead. And they stubbornly raise our eyes to values higher than self-gratification. They motivate us to build institutions and traditions instead of pleasure palaces, to think in centuries instead of decades, to invest instead of spend. They explode our illusions of autonomy and self-sufficiency. Children remind us that we ourselves were once dependent, products of risks and sacrifices by those who came before us and loved us. They teach us something about God's own relational life by embodying what it is to beget another person. They inspire hope, enable us to touch the future, and give us a kind of shadow of immortality. Most of all, they teach us patience, compassion, and selfless love, which is the highest horizontal aim of any creature. And learning all of this is profoundly good for us. It grows our souls. It steadies our bones. Honestly, if having children weren't a divine gift, I'd expect to have to pay someone for the good it's done me. But think about Abraham and Sarah and what Isaac was to them. That child wasn't just an answer to a barren couple's prayer, although he certainly was that. Have you ever thought about what Isaac represents in the grand biblical narrative? All those stars and grains of sand symbolize descendants Abraham would gain through this one boy. And the New Testament makes it clear that those weren't just physical descendants. They weren't just the Jews. God was talking about a promise that Isaac embodied, that Abraham would inherit the entire world and all its nations through Isaac. In an important way, Isaac was the hope for a new creation out of a worn out and dying old one. If you get right down to it, you could summarize the entire story of the Bible as God making a new human race to answer the prayer of an infertile couple. And it's not even the greatest gift that God has ever given the world through a child. When he set out to accomplish redemption itself, in fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham, he did so by descending from the sky, not like Superman, but by entering a girl's womb and becoming a baby. In other words, the world was saved not in spite of the process of childbearing and child rearing, but through it. Salvation itself was accomplished by means of that ancient and beautiful pattern God set up in Eden. And he himself blessed and inhabited this creative process. He took a real and natural family, and he gave himself to them, and ultimately, through them, to all of us as a living gift. Each of the children he gives us to love and to educate is similarly a gift, one that he expects us to nurture after the example and into the image of Jesus Christ. But this time, God is the one doing the adopting instead of Joseph. One of my favorite books on theology is one that you've no doubt all not only heard of, but probably read. J.I. Packer's Knowing God. And easily the section that stands out to most in my memory in the whole book is his chapter on the neglected doctrine of adoption. We Protestants just celebrated Reformation Day, which of course commemorates Martin Luther's challenge against practices of the late medieval church that had obscured justification. Packer writes that in justification, we are declared not guilty in the courtroom of God's justice. But we don't stay in the courtroom. We move into God's family room. Packer reminds us of how the New Testament portrays the justified as being not merely acquitted of sin, but adopted as God's own children. We often gloss over this amazing language, but he dwells on it in this book. If God has adopted us in Christ, then that means we are Jesus's younger siblings. And our job is to look to him to teach us the household rules so that gradually we take on the family resemblance. Here's the crazy part, though. Our families and our households are one of the means through which God does his adopting. We subtly catch this weird idea from our culture that our children shouldn't be indoctrinated. This bugs me endlessly. The idea is that we should just let them grow up and decide what they believe for themselves. And of course, we can't ultimately guarantee their faith or faithfulness. I'm not suggesting that. That's a matter of their freedom and God's grace. But that doesn't mean we should raise them as somehow neutral on the most important of all questions. If we wouldn't qualify our certainty when we teach our kids math, that 6 times 5 equals 30, why would we qualify our certainty when we teach them that Jesus is risen and is the Lord of heaven and earth? Why? Remember, not to answer those big who, what, where, why questions is to invite someone else to answer them. God is not ambiguous in Scripture about the calling of Christian parents. It's not to feed and clothe our children just so the world can adopt them. A friend of mine makes a habit of reminding his teenage son and his family of his family identity and his allegiance every time he walks out the door. I love this. He says, "Remember, son, you are a Stenberg. Wear that name well." I'm trying to do the same with my kids. I say, "Remember, Astrid, Elijah, Peter, Aubrey, you are Morrises. Remember what we taught you and what we're teaching you. Wear the name well." And I have a right to say that and to expect that of them because they do represent Gabby and me. They were given to us. They are for us. The same goes for the children of every parent that our schools educate. That's why we do what we do. But the reason we do this isn't only because we're self-interested. Certainly not because we're selfish or egotistical. I should hope not. It's because we ultimately believe that the identity we are imparting to our children as Christians aligns with their very truest natures as creatures of God. This path, if they choose to remain in it after we've introduced them to it, will lead to eternal blessedness and splendor and joy. And that brings us to our third answer to the big question. What are children for? They're for themselves. C.S. Lewis has a great line in the Screwtape Letters. He has a lot of great lines. He's got a great line in the Screwtape Letters where the senior devil, instructing his nephew on the finer points of selfishness as a sin you can tempt people to, explain why it is that the enemy, God, demands that humans love their neighbors as themselves. He writes this: "The enemy wants to kill their animal self-love as soon as possible,
but
it is his long-term policy, I fear, to restore to them a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. When they have really learned to love their neighbors as themselves, they will be allowed to love themselves as their neighbors. For we must never forget what is the most repellent and inexplicable trait of our enemy. He really loves the hairless bipeds he has created and always gives back to them with his right hand what he has taken away with his left. God demands that we consider others better than ourselves in this life, but it's not because he wants us to hate ourselves. It's because he knows that only by learning to love as he does can our sinful selfishness be transformed into genuine, holy gratitude for how wondrous we all are. The liberal arts is a term that we use a lot in classical Christian education. It's the core, really. They're often described as the freeing arts. That's, of course, the root of the term. In the ancient context, this was meant to distinguish them from the servile arts, to signify that these are the things which free men contemplate, not for their own enjoyment, but so that they can take part in government and the life of their city-state. To be educated as a free man or woman was to be educated as a ruler. In the Christian context, a liberal education takes on a much greater depth of meaning. Yes, we are educating free rulers, not only for cities and countries, but for God's world. And we free them not by demanding of them something that they don't have, or by taking them outside of their natural environment, but by bringing out the wondrous potential that is already latent in them. In short, by helping them to be more deeply and truly themselves as they were meant to be. Remember the whale. It wasn't set free by being dragged outside its natural environment. It is most free when it's living where God made it to live, doing what God made it to do with its marvelous whale abilities. In the same way, for children to be truly free means for them to be educated into the type of creations they were intended to be by nature. And this is the part I feel like is so wonderful. In living that nature, they will find their truest joy. The Westminster Shorter Catechism says that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. It's a famous line. This idea actually comes straight from St. Augustine. The Westminster Divines didn't make it up. He famously said that human hearts are restless until we find our rest in God. This is the main point of another of my favorite popular theology books, John Piper's Desiring God. I like books where the titles are just a verb and then God. The central argument of the book is that we don't actually have to choose between pursuing joy and obeying God, because in Piper's view, they're actually one and the same. Our deepest and most eternal delight as creatures created by God, designed to glorify and enjoy him, is actually nothing other than glorifying and enjoying God. In fact, every single joy and pleasure that we attempt to substitute for this one, this supreme joy, will ultimately turn out to be, in Lewis's memorable words, like eating mud pies in the slums. We're not just raising and teaching our children to love God because we want them to share our religion. We're doing so because we actually believe, deep down in the concrete foundations of our souls and convictions, that knowing and loving and desiring God was what they were made for. And when we do this, we're guiding them to the highest possible joy that they could have, the highest possible flourishing and happiness. Whoever drinks of this water, Jesus told a thirsty woman, will never thirst again. What are children given to us for? So that we can guide them to the best well with the sweetest water, the one they really desire, even if they don't know it yet. And now we come to the last answer to the big question. What are children for? And this answer is they're for the world. When we educate our sons and daughters in the way that we're committed to educating them here, we're preparing kings and queens who will rule over God's creation and serve their neighbors through their presence, their votes, their leadership, their choices, their words, their entire lives. We want them to grow up as Christians who believe in their deepest being that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Yes, we want that. But if he tarries, they will also grow up as neighbors and friends and co-workers and bosses, pastors, mothers, and fathers. They will have earthly and temporal callings and duties alongside their heavenly one. And if this classical education thing we're doing takes, they will be precisely those neighbors who have thought most deeply about the crucial questions. And therefore, they will be natural and obvious leaders. This is where a good theology of Christ's ascension and his present reign comes in, I think. Whether you're amillennial or postmillennial or premillennial or just not sure what millennial to pick, I believe one of the things we are Bible bound to embrace without any ambiguity is that Jesus Christ is currently reigning over all things, especially his church. He is on the throne of the new creation right now, seated at the right hand of God the Father, having been given all authority in heaven and on earth. And since, according to Hebrews, his constant task there is praying for and interceding for us, we should remember what he prayed while he was still here on earth and what he taught us to pray as well. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Have you ever stopped to think what we're actually asking for there? That God's kingdom and his will would unfold here on earth in exactly the same way that it presently does in heaven. This world is now subject to King Jesus. He teaches us to pray that it would look like heaven. And according to 2 Corinthians 5:17, we ourselves are citizens of the new creation, if indeed we are in Christ. And our children are entrusted to us expressly so that we can give them back to God as Abraham was willing to do with his son Isaac. So connecting a few dots here, that means that we are to parent and to teach and minister as if our homes and our schools and our churches are ground zero for the transformation, we might say reconquest of God's world. And our children are one of the primary means of that transformation. They enter the world just like the Pevensey children entered the wardrobe. Yes, they will have enemies waiting for them, deadly ones even. But they are the rightful rulers. They have crowns and a castle waiting for them. And this world will not be right or free of its cursed winter unless these sons and daughters of the last Adam are reigning here as he presently does in heaven. Of course, that is an enormous responsibility, one which will never be realized without Christ's power and can never fully be realized until he returns. Raising and educating children for the life of the world means that the eyes of the world are going to be on them, on us. We should be under no illusions about how arduous and dangerous this calling is, and how badly we can be hurt if our children don't take part in it. But others who have undertaken this same journey long before us also understood the risks. Thanksgiving is just around the corner. So it's probably appropriate to end this talk with a word from John Winthrop, leader and eventual governor of the first wave of colonists to Massachusetts Bay, which was the second English settlement after Plymouth. In 1630, on the passage from England, he preached a lay sermon. He was a lawyer, not a minister, entitled A Model of Christian Charity. It's often referred to as the City on a Hill speech. Preparing a huddle of colonists to confront the opportunities and dangers of the New World, and conscious of the fact that they were attempting to produce a Christian commonwealth that would have historical, maybe even eschatological significance, their imaginations were big. He gave them these words about their mission. The end is to improve our lives, to do more service to the Lord. The comfort and increase of the body of Christ, whereof we are members, that ourselves and posterity may be better preserved from the common corruptions of this evil world, to serve the Lord and work out our salvation under the power and purity of his holy ordinances. Now, the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other. Make others' conditions our own. Rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God, and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, his power, his goodness, and his truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that all men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. I like to add, like that of Geneva. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. Beloved, there is now set before us life and good, death and evil, in that we are commanded this day to love the Lord our God, to love one another, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and ordinances and his laws, and the articles of our covenant with him, that we may live and be multiplied, and that the Lord our God may bless us in the land whither we go to possess it. Therefore, he says, let us choose life, that we and our seed may live, by obeying his voice and cleaving to him. For he is our life and our prosperity. this is what children are for. This is why we are committed to living countercultural lives, so that with God's blessing, one day, perhaps, the way we raise and teach our kids in our homes and in this school and in schools like it might not be so countercultural anymore. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my talk given last month to the Association of Classical Christian Educators Regional Gathering at Geneva Classical Academy in Lakeland, Florida. Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.